Terrifier 3. Chapter 1. The Return. Sienna Shaw stirred in her sleep, her dreams haunted by the images of blood and chaos that had marred her life the past year. The face of Art the Clown loomed in the shadows of her subconscious, that grotesque smile frozen in a macabre expression that had seared into her memory. She woke up with a jolt, her heart pounding, covered in sweat despite the cold December air creeping into her room. It was Christmas Eve, a time that was supposed to bring joy, but for Sienna, it only brought back the trauma she thought she had buried deep. Outside, the town was illuminated with festive lights, but Sienna couldn't shake the foreboding darkness that had followed her since that night. Art was gone, or so they said. But she knew better. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. Sienna? It was her brother Jonathan, his voice uneasy. She swung her legs over the bed and padded towards the door. "What's wrong, John?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. He stood there, pale as a ghost, holding a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. "I think you need to see this." She unfolded the paper, her stomach twisting as she read the words, "You're on my list this Christmas. Let's see if you've been naughty or nice." The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, a crude drawing of a clown's face. Art was back. Want to know how Art's twisted return unfolds? Stay tuned. Subscribe and share to follow the terrifying journey of Sienna. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. The paper felt like ice in Sienna's hand, her breath hitching as she stared at the crude drawing. Art the Clown, he wasn't just a nightmare lingering in her head. He was real, and he was coming for her. Jonathan shifted uneasily. "It was in the mailbox this morning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know if I should tell you, but after everything..." His voice trailed off, filled with uncertainty and fear. Sienna's hands trembled, but she forced herself to remain calm. "We need to call the police," she said, her mind racing. "They can? Do what?" Jonathan cut her off, frustration creeping into his tone. "They didn't stop him before, and they won't stop him now. No one can. Art, he's not human. You know that." Sienna wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the words caught in her throat. He was right. They had both seen what Art could do, how he could shrug off death like it was an inconvenience. But she couldn't just sit back and wait for him to strike. "Where's Mom?" Sienna asked suddenly, her pulse quickening. Jonathan glanced down the hallway. "She went to visit Aunt Jess for Christmas." "I didn't tell her about this." Sienna felt a cold dread coil in her chest. Their mother was out of town, vulnerable. Was she on Art's list, too? Had she already been marked? The phone on the table buzzed, breaking the tense silence. Sienna grabbed it, her heart hammering as she saw the unknown number. A single message blinked on the screen. "I'm coming to spread some holiday cheer." A chill ran down her spine. Think you've seen the worst? The true terror has only just begun. Subscribe and share to uncover the horrors awaiting Sienna. Chapter 3. The Hunt Begins. Sienna paced the living room, the weight of the message sinking into her bones. Jonathan sat on the couch, nervously biting his nails, his eyes darting to the windows every few seconds, as though expecting to see Art's twisted grin appear in the glass at any moment. "We can't stay here," she said, finally breaking the heavy silence. "If he knows where we live, we're sitting ducks." Jonathan looked up at her, his face pale. "Where would we even go? He's probably watching us right now." The thought chilled Sienna to the core, but she pushed it down, refusing to let the fear paralyze her. "We'll go to the police station, stay there until we figure something out." "You think he can't get to us there?" Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. "You saw what he did last time, how nothing stopped him. What if? I don't care." Sienna snapped, the words harsher than she intended. She softened her tone, sitting down next to him. "I know you're scared. I am too. But we can't just give up. We have to do something." Jonathan nodded reluctantly, and they both stood, gathering a few essentials. Sienna grabbed her father's old hunting knife from the drawer, the cold steel a strange comfort in her hand. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they headed for the door, the sound of a slow, deliberate knock froze them in their tracks. Sienna's heart leapt into her throat. They exchanged a glance, neither daring to move. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Jonathan shook his head frantically. "Don't answer it." But Sienna's feet were already moving, carrying her toward the door as though she were in a trance. Her hand hovered over the handle, trembling. Slowly, she opened the door, just a crack. Nothing. She stepped outside, her eyes scanning the empty street. No one in sight. But something felt wrong, like the air itself was tainted with a lingering malice. She turned to head back inside when a shadow flickered in the corner of her vision. Before she could react, something cold and sharp grazed her neck, a faint, maniacal giggle echoing in the night. Art was already here. The hunt is on. Will Sienna survive? Hit subscribe and share if you want to see how this twisted tale unfolds. Chapter 4. The Trap. Sienna's mind raced, every instinct screaming for her to run, but her body felt paralyzed. The dark alley beside her seemed to pulse with unseen danger, the faint smell of decay lingering in the air. She could almost feel Art's presence lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jonathan's voice jolted her back to reality. "Sienna," he hissed from the doorway, his face a mask of terror. "Get inside." She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the threshold as she slammed the door shut. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," Jonathan muttered, pacing frantically. "We're trapped." Sienna's mind whirled, trying to think of a way out. They couldn't stay in the house. Art had proven time and time again that walls and doors meant nothing to him. But where could they go? Suddenly, an idea struck her. "The basement?" Jonathan frowned. "What about it?" "It's a trap," Sienna explained, her voice steadier now. "We lure him down there. There's only one way in and out. If we can get him inside, we might have a chance." "A chance to do what?" Jonathan asked, his skepticism clear. "You think we can kill him?" "I don't know," Sienna admitted, the desperation in her voice growing. "But it's better than waiting for him to pick us off like prey." Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Let's do it." They hurried to the basement, turning the lights off behind them as they descended into the darkness. The air was musty, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the space. Sienna grabbed the length of chain from an old toolbox, wrapping it tightly around the door handle. If Art got in, she would make sure he couldn't get out. Jonathan positioned himself in the far corner, clutching a rusty pipe he'd found. Sienna crouched behind the stairs, her father's knife clutched tightly in her hand. And then they waited. Minutes passed, each second stretching into an eternity. Sienna's muscles ached from the tension, her senses heightened to every creak and groan of the old house above them. Suddenly, the basement door creaked open. The familiar shuffle of Art's footsteps echoed down the stairs, the sound sending a fresh wave of terror through Sienna's body. She held her breath, every muscle tensing as his grotesque form appeared at the top of the staircase. He paused, tilting his head in that strange, inhuman way, as though savoring the fear in the air. And then, slowly, he began to descend. Is Art finally trapped? Or has Sienna fallen into his twisted game? Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe and share to see the deadly conclusion. Chapter 5. The Monster's Game. Art's shoes tapped lightly on the wooden steps as he slowly descended into the basement. Each footstep echoed in Sienna's ears, her heart racing as she remained crouched behind the stairs. The dim light of the basement cast eerie shadows, stretching Art's already grotesque form into something even more monstrous. Her grip tightened around the knife. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. This was their only shot. Art reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, his head tilting as if he knew something was off. His beady eyes scanned the darkness, and for a moment, Sienna was sure he could see her. But instead of moving toward her, he took a few slow, deliberate steps toward Jonathan, who was crouched in the corner, waiting to strike. Jonathan's breath hitched as Art closed in, his hands gripping the rusty pipe so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sienna's mind raced, this was it. If she didn't act now, they'd lose the only advantage they had. In one swift motion, she lunged from her hiding spot, the blade gleaming as she aimed for the clown's back. But just as she was about to strike, Art spun around with an unnatural speed, his grin widening in cruel delight. Sienna's knife grazed his arm, drawing a thin line of blood, but Art didn't even flinch. Instead, he laughed, silent, hysterical, and backhanded her with a force that sent her sprawling onto the cold basement floor. The impact rattled her bones, and the knife clattered out of her hand, skidding across the floor. Art didn't give her a second to recover. He was on her in an instant, his hands wrapping around her throat, squeezing with a strength that belied his lanky frame. Her vision blurred, dark spots dancing at the edges of her sight as she gasped for air. Jonathan screamed, charging at Art with the pipe. He swung it with all his might, but Art was faster. The clown ducked under the blow, and before Jonathan could react, Art grabbed the pipe from his hands and swung it back at him, cracking it against his ribs. Jonathan crumpled to the floor, gasping in pain. Sienna's mind was fading, the world around her growing dim. Art's face was the last thing she saw, his grin growing wider, his eyes glinting with sadistic pleasure. And then, just as the darkness was about to swallow her whole, the basement door slammed open with a deafening bang. Chapter 6. A Final Stand. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the basement as a figure burst through the door, charging toward Art with a fierce yell. It was Burke, the orderly from the asylum, his face a mask of fury. "Get away from them," he roared, swinging a metal crowbar at Art with all his might. Art released Sienna, his head snapping toward Burke with a look of surprise. He dodged the first swing, but Burke was relentless, forcing Art to retreat toward the back of the basement. Sienna coughed, gasping for air as she crawled toward Jonathan, who was still writhing in pain. "We have to move," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Come on." Jonathan groaned, clutching his side as he struggled to stand. Together, they staggered toward the stairs, leaving Burke to face the monster. Art danced around Burke's swings, his movements fluid and unpredictable. But the orderly wasn't backing down. With every blow, he drove Art further into the basement, away from Sienna and Jonathan. Sienna reached the top of the stairs and turned back, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't just leave Burke down there to face Art alone. Not after everything. With a newfound resolve, she grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor and charged back down the stairs. Burke's crowbar collided with Art's arm, sending him stumbling. That was the opening Sienna needed. With a scream, she drove the wooden stake into Art's side, the sharp end sinking deep into his flesh. Art's eyes widened in shock, his grin faltering for the first time. But even as blood poured from the wound, Art's hand shot out, grabbing Sienna by the throat. His grip tightened, and for a moment, Sienna thought it was all over. Then, with one final, desperate swing, Burke brought the crowbar down on Art's head with a sickening crack. The clown's grip loosened, and he collapsed to the floor, motionless. Sienna fell back, gasping for air as she stared at Art's lifeless body. Could it really be over? Burke leaned heavily on the crowbar, panting. "Is he?" Sienna didn't answer. She knew better than to believe it was over. Art had a way of coming back, no matter how many times they thought they'd killed him. But for now, at least, the nightmare was over. The end.